Hi, I'm Andy.
I'm Alex.
We're co-founders of Kortical, and we like talking about AI and machine learning. And today we're going to talk about how to create an AI product roadmap. Over to you.
All right. So, why are we talking about how to create an AI roadmap? Surely it's the same as regular software.
Great question, Alex. I think the thing is that when we think about software roadmaps, what we've often seen is they're talking about how to pass data from one place to another, or how to manage data moving around. So typical sort of software use cases would be, I've got an app and I want to talk to my bank, and that's replacing the way I used to communicate with my bank. So now how do I get the data from here to there, in a nice structured format? Another one might be, I've got a workflow process, and so instead of doing it via email and spreadsheets and everyone trying to have to keep track and having a board or whatever, now you can just have some sort of nice workflow system that sort of says, here's the ticket, here's all the data related to it, and we're moving it from here to here. I think what's different about AI and machine learning use cases is often that they're trying to think about how to replace an existing process. So you've got like someone who's doing lending, or different ways that people are working. And I think that sort of it's not as easy for people to intuit. So I think the things, we've got 20 years of web experience of basically, no one figured out how to use the web for 20 years. Now everyone's like, oh, of course you just build an app for that, and you just hook this up to that, and of course we do a workflow system. But I mean, it literally took us 20 years after the web was invented to figure that out. So, the first thing that we can do, the obvious low-hanging fruit for AI, is let's replace what we're already doing. But not everyone knows how to do that yet. And actually, there's a lot of subtleties to data and how it would work, so it's really, it helps to have an expert in the room.
Yeah, I think another thing as well that you just made me think of is actually, you don't necessarily know it's going to work with AI. When you embark on a web app creation, you're pretty sure you can build a web app. That's a given, right? But if you're like, we're going to automate this process, well, it might be really hard. You might not get a sufficient amount of accuracy to make it actually worth the time and money you're spending on it.
That's a great point.
It does mess with things. So there's always that element of sort of experimentation and iteration that you just don't get with regular software.
Yeah, no, absolutely, 100%.
So, do you actually need to do an AI roadmap before you embark, do we think?
Yeah, so I don't think you need to do one every time. So I think the obvious answer is no. I mean, sometimes you know as well I do, that you show it to a customer and they say, I want to do this, and it's the only obvious thing to do. So in some cases, it's just incredibly obvious what you should do.
Yeah.
In other cases, though, you find that you go somewhere, you're going into a project and there are more options, or it's not obvious which one you should do, and therefore I think sort of, that always makes sense. I think the other factor is actually the more senior you tend to go. So if you're speaking to someone who kind of owns one business function, then maybe there aren't really that many options, because they're sort of like, we do this type of triage in the call center. So you're like, right, we need to automate that sort of triage in the call center. Whereas, if you're dealing with C-suite, if you're dealing with executive, then often you can take it sort of a more sort of first principles look at the business, really try to find out where to find, the best places to apply AI. And so I think, it varies a lot, and I think it really depends. The more senior you're going, the more it makes sense to do a roadmap.
Well, you've definitely seen that, sometimes you go into a client and you've been brought in by a specific champion who wants to sort of have a showcase, and that proves to be successful, and that actually leads to that conversation where you then do the roadmap, because they've sort of shown to the sort of C-suite or whatever that AI can actually bring value, and their eyes are opened and they want to find out where else they can apply it. So one can lead to the other, basically.
Yeah, and I actually think, really, we talk about the AI roadmap, and actually we're going to show you how to build it, a bunch more use cases than the first one. But I think the real thing that you're trying to do with almost any AI roadmap is, because AI is seen as a bit experimental, there's maybe not that much funding for it. So what you really want to do is you want to find that really sort of lighthouse use case where you can just dive in, create a whole load of value really quickly, make everyone in the business wake up and go, oh crap, AI is going to change things, I need to get on board the AI ship. Then you attract the people, you attract the investment, you unlock access to data, people start working with you. And so, I think sort of, we're building a roadmap, but really we're really trying to find that first, one or two use cases we can really explore them and find out what's going to work, basically.
Yeah, and if you can actually get some ROI off those use cases, actually then you're playing with the house's money, right? It's almost a given you're going to do more because you've already made money off the first one. It's sort of paying for itself rather than being a risk.
I mean, we see a lot of people, when we pitch against people, that they come in with these huge plans, and they're going, we're going to change up your teams, we're going to do all the stuff, we're going to do everything. And that can just get so bogged down. There's going to be so much politics in doing that. Whereas if you just try to get in and say, we're going to go in light, we're going to find the use case, discover what we can do, then we're going to have a small, really, tight team that's going to just focus in on solving that problem, getting that use case live, and then you start to build up the function from there. It's faster. Like you say, you start playing with the house's money. It just seems like a better way overall.
Actually touched on something that's actually quite interesting, and it's almost born out of the fact that we know that like Gartner says 8% of AI projects are successful. So like there's quite a lot of people who are rightfully skeptical of AI. So they might be senior people, they might be people who are on the front lines who have to work with these systems or implement them. And actually, when you've done that successful first use case, you start to change their minds, and it becomes easier. There's less politics. There's less sort of treacle slowing you down in terms of actually, delivering on the roadmap.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, so we're doing a roadmap, right? Who should be in the room for the road mapping session, and how should it work?
Okay, so our experience is basically you want the sign-off stakeholder, because if they're going to write the checks, they're going to say that the project's good. So you need them on board through the whole process. So not necessarily through the whole process, but especially through the what are we going to do, how is it strategically aligned, what is the business value. They're going to be the ones who can really answer those questions. Then you basically want the domain expert. So the domain expert is the person who's going to really understand all of those processes across the business, how everything works in detail. So you can kind of really dive in and kind of get the understanding of how processes work and what may be automatable or what you may be able to sort of augment. And then you want the data expert. So this is the person who really knows how you can, where the data is stored, what data is there, and how you can get access to it. Because I think sort of one of the biggest blockers of AI in enterprise is the data exists, but you can't get access to it. So it's really sort of like being able to sort of knock off that challenge straight away. So I think basically having someone who represents all of those, and then obviously you want to have, your AI expert in the room. And I think the thing is that sort of saying AI expert is too generic, because basically, you've got the guys over at Google, DeepMind, and sort of and all this sort of stuff are building recurrent, reinforcement learning, and basically doing sort of, chinchilla, and you have the guys who are sort of, making transformers and at Google Brain, and other people at Google and other places. Yannick Kuhn probably deserves a good mention as well. And these guys are all amazing researchers, but I'd say one of the things where they may not have is that sort of, the more business focused side of the knowledge. So I think that's why you want sort of more of an AI applications expert, if we're going to name it like that.
Right, yeah, they don't need to learn about backprop and capsule networks necessarily. They need to know what's the right tool for this job, and is it going to work, and how much data do we need to make it work.
Exactly. And I think the other thing is that sort of, what you want is you want someone who actually has hands-on experience with machine learning, because I think you get a lot of these people now who, they've read about data science, they've got a sort of high level understanding of data science, but I think one of the things that we've often seen is that those people can really sort of maybe just miss, given this data, what's really possible. So you want people who've been hands-on practitioners, who've solved a lot of problems with machine learning, who've seen a lot of use cases, seen what the data looks like, seen what they've been able to produce at the end, and have a real, a lot of experience going from data to working solution.
Have that kind of hard-won skepticism. I think data's probably going to be rubbish. And you're probably not going to be able to train like a transformer model. You might have 50,000 rows rather than 10 million. Right?
Exactly. Transformer models are amazing, but there's not many applications for them in business yet. I think on the other side, though, is that basically you want someone who's a bit of, want the AI expert to also sort of just kind of be adjacent to sort of being sort of like a business consultant type person. Someone who's able to sort of, digest a business really quickly. They've got a good idea of, how a business operates, what those mechanisms are, how things function, so that when they're having the systems and processes described to them, they can say, okay, yes, I think I can see how to optimize this. So I think you've got the sort of traditional sort of, business consultant that you get at all the big fours, but you want that with that sort of deep hands-on expertise. And I think if you can get the combination of that person, that's the sort of AI application expert you want in the room, basically.
Yeah, because if you've just got that AI without the business, then often you're optimizing for something that isn't totally aligned with the business case. So you're trying to maximize your ROC, AUC, or various other metrics which we know don't necessarily always align with the end product. And it's like having someone that you know, if you're not that person, having someone that you know who you can work closely with, who can bring you, sort of challenge you and make sure that you're just aligned and speaking the language of the business and not just going off into the optimization fairyland.
Yeah, yeah, and I think it's sort of like, as one of our friends likes to say, sort of, you know, you've got, you know, another application is sort of, you know, you could have returns at a sort of retail goods store, you know, and you could just sort of like dive in and start doing really complex modelling, but maybe, you know, a much simpler analysis just says, well, if someone is going to do more than 10 returns, let's just cut them off. And so it doesn't need to have some sort of complex modelling. So actually just having someone who's kind of taking more of a business lens as well as a machine learning lens, I can say when not to use machine learning. You know, it's
you're not constantly trying to find nails for your machine learning hammer.
Yeah. So basically we've got the process, right? So basically kind of we talked through who's in the room.
Okay.
So let's kind of go into the process, right? So
You got something to show me?
I do. I'm actually, here's something I prepared earlier. Alrighty. So let me just click here.
Cool.
Okay, cool. So here's like generic retail website. And the idea here is we're just going to do a little bit of a role play of kind of, you know, going through the process of creating the roadmap and how we do our process, right? So generic retail company, they're selling products on their site.
Yeah.
And they're going to do all of the things that generic retail company does.
Yeah.
So our typical sort of approach to use case discovery is going to be taking a first principles approach. So basically, what are the main revenues drivers? What are the main cost drivers? And then, like we say, sort of talking through those processes end to end. So basically, here's some I created earlier. So maybe we can just talk through sort of, you know, if we're thinking about sort of the top of the funnel, most businesses, let's say the retail business, it might be someone starts off thinking, I really want to buy those new Nike Air Jordans, and so I'm going to go to the Edit Man London, which is run by a friend of mine. Shameless plug. Yeah. So basically, like at the top of the funnel, they're basically trying to think, all right, well, I'm spending all this money. What is actually working? Because actually, you know, people aren't just seeing. Someone might see one ad and click, but maybe they actually saw 5 different ads and a couple of videos, and so what along their sort of, you know, journey actually sort of got them really hooked and wasn't really just that last thing that made them click. So if you can basically say, okay, here's all the different things they've seen across all these different people, and then you can start to say, okay, we can say, okay, yeah, these couple of bits of content are really key because everybody who ends up clicking has seen one of these bits of content, where actually that last bit of content maybe isn't as key. So just being able to understand sort of what's working, what isn't, why, that can be hugely valuable to a business to sort of optimize its revenue.
Right, and it's that time domain element that's kind of complex to do with like traditional attribution. It's like what sequence of things was important.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
And then sort of marketing mix modeling is sort of, you know, pretty self-explanatory. Then we sort of, you know, retargeting, personalization. So, I mean, with this one, it could be saying, right, well, you know, you've got all of your, you know, IDs, which are on, which were being tracked. So you've got your Yahoo ID, you've got your, you know, LinkedIn ID, your Facebook ID. You got all these different IDs, and then you were saying, right, well, there's different ads we could show you. So which group should we put you in? So you're going to see what type of content, and so, you know, if you're dealing with a retail store, you know, were you someone who was sort of like, with all the things you were looking at, was it more heavily focused on shoes? Was it more heavily focused on bags? Were you in the sort of women's wear, men's wear? Is it sort of casual? Is it more, you know, like evening wear? And so basically, if we're going to be trying to target you with things, what sort of things will you more likely respond to? So that sort of thing. You know, real-time product recommendation. You know, that's what we're doing as well. And that's one where, you know, this is quite cool actually. So what's cool here is you're tracking a user actually interacting with your website. So actually, I mean, we do this with a major retailer, and actually they have, you know, millions of users a week coming to the website, but a lot of those users are first-time users.
Yeah.
You know, so if you're going to do traditional sort of, you know, non-negative matrix factorization, you have to wait until they've actually got the purchases before you can start modeling what they're likely to want next. Whereas with this, you can basically say, well, what sequence of interactions with the website have they had, and who does that start to look like, and then really quickly start to find out what they're likely to want to add to their basket next. And I mean, you know, the scores that we got, you know, versus
it was awesome. I'm also just very glad you didn't make me say non-negative matrix factorization. Always trips me up.
Cool. So I mean, I think we kind of, hopefully people are getting the idea. You know, they're like, I mean, this is by no means an exhaustive list, but it's just sort of, you know, the way we'd be thinking about it is sort of like starting, okay, you're starting with the ads. What's going on with the ads? Okay, so now they're getting to your website. What can we do on the website? What's going on with the website? Okay, then sort of like, then they're getting to the basket. Okay, what's going on in that basket journey? Okay, now they've bought the product. Okay, now that they've bought the product, what are we thinking about with the sort of the customer service there? How's automated that? What's going on with the logistics? What's going on with the supply chain? So it's really just sort of like really working through all of those things, coming up with all the use cases along the way, and then basically kind of putting them all down. And so, I mean, putting them in a spreadsheet is a good way. Often if we're doing this in person, we do it with a board because it's just kind of, meaty and visual. Yeah. And so then once we've done all this sort of thing, we try to work with people in the room to get these things scored. So we don't want them scored for business value, for strategic alignment. We then, as the AI experts, score them for the solution complexity, and then we sort of like work with the data owner to kind of understand how hard it's going to be to get access to the data. So, in this case, like the ad spend attribution might sound really great, but we're working with all the third parties to get all the data, might be really challenging. So we might say, okay, yeah, that's not great. Same for the retargeting stuff, that's mixed into other platforms, hard to do necessarily. But then sort of, things on the website like real-time product recommendation, offer personalization, SKU optimization, those things could be really easy to do. So then it's kind of like, okay, great. And then we can actually see, they got really strong strategic alignment because maybe the business is focused on revenue generating rather than sort of revenue saving stuff. So, customer service automation might be hugely valuable to the business. Like if you're looking in pure like value terms, equally aligned. But if you're looking at the strategic alignment, you're just not going to get as much buy-in from the business if you're trying to go, hey, we're going to save you money, versus if you say, hey, we're going to make you money. So, that's why we think sort of having both the focus on the business value and the strategic alignment is important.
Yeah, for sure.
Anything you want to add on this one?
No, it's really interesting. I mean, it's like you said, it's often if you could do it on a three-dimensional Bible, it'd be better. It's like all of these factors are very interesting, and obviously what you want to do is pick that low-hanging fruit that's like kind of
exactly.
Preemption this slide.
Preempting everything, right. So basically, I think the thing is like, so we're trying to basically create that sort of simple 2D projection, and this is by no means really scientific. This is more a finger in the air, but it's just sort of like what we're working with. So if you think sort of business value plus strategic alignment divided by 2, so, actual real material value is more important than strategic alignment. By some modification factor, you can choose whatever you want. And then we're basically saying, solution complexity plus data complexity, because they're pretty much, it's really sort of like how long is it going to take to do, how long is it going to take to get the data.
Yeah, sort of, I don't know, in a linear way.
Yeah. So then if we do that, we take a look at our nice sort of chart. So So we flipped the axis of the total complexity just because it's not nice to see the best things be in the bottom right hand corner.
Bottom right is where you want it to be. The top right.
Top right. Yeah. So, when we look at it in this way, we can see, like email offer optimization, the value is super high and the total complexity is really low. So that sort of looks like a really good one. Then we've got sort of, real-time product recommendation, real-time offer personalization. And basically the way to think of this is, we just kind of think of almost getting a triangle and pushing it back. And you kind of see, right, well, this is sort of the sequence that we probably want to be thinking about looking at them with. And actually, the email offer optimization is typically one for a retailer where you can get massive bang for buck really quickly and all of that. So, I mean, that is often a really good one to go for. So then basically sort of like in terms of like how we end up ranking them, so obviously we want to try to make something that kind of makes sense of a triangle. So if we're basically saying minus X, where X is the value plus alignment, basically plus Y, which is that total complexity, and then we get this nice ordered list, and now we've got a roadmap. Way. So basically, like we say, I think the thing here is we're really looking at those top few. Now, you could say top one, so we talked about the sort of top one and that sort of lighthouse project, and I think sort of, that's great, but if you can actually get the data for the top 3 or the top 5, if the data is easy to come by, you should just get all the data you can and then basically do the first step on all of them.
Sure, because it's like a non-zero chance of failure for any given use case.
Exactly.
It doesn't mean that AI as a whole needs to fail, it's like find one that does work, right? So basis.
Because otherwise you could just end up stuck with one where you sort of it looked good on paper, but when we actually saw the data, I mean, one of the typical ones that we sort of see is that something that sounds amazing, and then you actually, you look at the data and you find out that they said there was all this demographic data,
Yeah.
and it was self-filled in demographic data, and it's like NA in every column. So
Surely there's a key to join this database to this database. I didn't think of that.
Yeah, so there's all sorts of reasons why, in your high level meeting you might not discuss it. So if you can sort of leave the door open when you're doing your roadmap to say, hey, let's get the data from the top couple and then explore them. I think that's probably going to work best for most people trying to do an AI roadmap. Or you can back yourself into a corner and then try to get yourself out. Never done that before, right?
No.
Cool. Okay, so can you give some examples of basically, why do you think, what would you say is the difference between projects where we do the sort of the AI road mapping like phase, and what are some of the things that we've seen happen when we don't do the AI road mapping phase?
Yeah, I think often, it tends to be just almost like a selection bias towards different types of clients. So when you've got a client that's got a more pressing sort of tactical issue that they want to bring AI in for, they've kind of got something in mind, and often it's like the stakeholder level as well that you're coming in at. So they have seen a problem in their business. They think our AI, that's going to solve this. Talk to us, and we validate that or not, as the case may be. And then that tends to be kind of coming in, doing something quickly, and then maybe that'll lead to a roadmap discussion down the line, or maybe it won't, depending on that business and if there's much more scope for AI there. And then I guess there's the other way where it's kind of like the board's made a decision, they need AI, but they're not entirely sure where or how, but there's a general feeling that AI could be applied, so there's almost like a discovery phase, and we become kind of part of that and sort of help do a sort of top-down, very strategic view, and then things happen from on high, and we kind of get the right people in the room somewhere down the line, and then it's you almost like you end up with like here's the 3-year roadmap, and here's our vision, and these are the 60 use cases we might be able to do, and then we kind of almost the people in that boardroom don't necessarily know if the data's even there, but there's a huge there's a kind of discovery phase going all the way down to get in to almost do another AI roadmap within each sort of sub-department, and then you've got everything between the two really. So it's not like a binary thing where you might be in a stakeholder who's got a bunch of use cases, and we decide which one to do first with a very sort of cut down version of that roadmap. So it should always be on the agenda, I think, and if there's an opportunity to do more than one thing, we should question whether or not that's the right thing to do right now. But it certainly isn't the case you should always do it, because it's just sometimes you're not dealing at the right level, there's a need to do something immediately, and maybe some time criticality behind that as well.
Sometimes it's really obvious that you should do that one use case.
Yeah.
I'd say that actually a lot of the time that we get involved in projects that don't work out, it's actually because we get involved after they sort of say, this is the AI project we want to do.
Yeah.
And then a lot of the time the real hang-up becomes the data. It's basically they think this would be great, and they haven't actually looked at what data is available, and they're so locked into, we're going to do this project, and then you're actually at a point you're just kind of going, well, like I say, we don't have the keys to join up that data, and then it's like, oh, well then let's come back to this in 3 years after we put that key in, and then 3 years we'll come back after we've done this. But there would be so much more that they could actually do in the business, or they kind of go, and there was one with, like a predictive maintenance one, where they were just kind of like going, oh, like we have massive gaps in our data that we didn't realize, and then it's like, okay, well now we have to go away and like build up that data. So, like I said, I think the biggest thing the biggest challenge that people will run into is data. So most of the rest of it you can get around if you can, but if the data isn't there, you're just out of luck. And so if you kind of sort of sell too hard on what you're going to do before without doing the road mapping, you can get trapped into a project where there's just no way to make it successful. Whereas if you can do the road mapping, generally, in almost any business, there's enough digital systems right now where there's enough data hanging around where there's going to be a really good data set somewhere, and there's going to be something you can do to really add a lot of value to the business.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's almost like if we were to say one thing to clients thinking about doing AI stuff, bring in someone who knows about it as soon as possible, so they can tell you, let's start recording this data now. Say in 3 months we're going to do a project, but when we've come in it's 3 months later, then it's another 3 months before we can start if that data's not right. Yeah.
And actually for the next podcast, I think we're going to cover off, data, and basically just kind of like do a deep dive on what good data looks like for machine learning.
What is data? How can we find data?
Cool. All right. Well, look. Hopefully, this has been interesting for you guys to watch. If it is, like, let us know. This is our process. We've been sort of winging it as we go. So if you've got better ways of doing things or you've got interesting things, let us know. We'd love to hear. All right, thanks.
Like and subscribe.